Welcome back to the Pauper metagame. Are you guys ready to take a look at a really interactive deck with lots of back and forth play and intense interactive decisions? Alright, let's pull that up real quick. Right, I think I've got it queued up right here. That's right, you just got ghetto rickrolled. Because today we're going to look at Boggles, probably one of the least interactive decks in the format, but don't be fooled. You still gotta make a few decisions. You can't just go full zombie mindless mode because occasionally you will actually have to think about what you're doing. So let's jump right in. Alright, let's give this thing an overall grade. I haven't played Boggles a ton recently. I have tinkered with it in the past. I can't really be 100% about where this is right now, but I'm guessing it's like C plus, B minus, something like that. There's a huge amount of variability because Boggles is one of those decks that has certain matchups where it just destroys people. And then it has other matchups where it folds pretty hard. And then yet it has a lot of other matchups where it depends a lot on what sideboard cards you draw, a lot more than most matchups, and very dependent on what sideboard cards your opponent draws. I'm going to look at this list by Carves. Carves is a beast. He's currently the lead trophy holder in the Pauper League on Magic Online, and he's running a nice tight list. One of the things to point out here is he's got 1/1s, 1/1s, and 1/1s, backed up with a Heliod's Pilgrim, which is a 1/2. So Electrickery does blow this deck out pretty hard post sideboard. So it's not unusual to see a play pattern where you roll someone in when you're piloting Boggles. You roll someone in game one, game two they don't hit their Electrickeries on the sideboard. Even for those decks that have them, they don't hit their sideboard tech. We'll talk about all that in a bit about different cards that hate on Boggles, and you just roll them in game two, and boom, you're done with the match. You win, easy peasy. You can also have scenarios where there's some decks out there that'll run Electrickery in the main board. There's other forms of hate, and you could just easily just get blown out match after match after match with your opponent hitting their sideboard outs. So it's a very swingy list depending on how your opponents draw, how you draw, the matchups you run into. You could go 5-0 or 0-5, and there's just a huge amount of variability to it in my opinion. It is proactive though, so that's nice, going back to the old philosophy that there's no wrong threats, only wrong answers. I don't know that that's completely true, but you get the idea. Anyway, enough about the deck's power and where it is and the meta and grade and all that. Let's jump into some of the particular cards. So we've got, again, we're looking at 1/1 hexproof creature for 1 mana, another 1/1 hexproof creature for 1 mana, and a 1/1 creature that can only be blocked by flyers for 2 mana, a Solana Ledgewalker. So the idea is we have these hexproof creatures and we're going to suit them up with a bunch of enchantments, the big payoffs being Ethereal Armor, which is a 1 white mana enchant creature. Enchant creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control, and first strike. So you stack up some enchantments on the board, slap an Ethereal Armor on a hexproof creature, and start going to town. Hexproof means they cannot just chump you forever, because it gives +2/+0 and equally as important, trample. Armadillo Cloak also grants trample along with +2/+2 and lifelink. So 3 mana enchantment. This can be one of your outs against the burn matchup. Ancestral Mask is a pretty big payoff. For 3 mana enchant creature gets +2/+2 for each other enchantment on the battlefield. One thing I will note in passing here is that, and this is a subtle nuance, but again this goes back to not going full zombie mode here. Ethereal Armor grants +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. Ancestral Mask says enchant creature gets +2/+2 for each other enchantment on the battlefield. This can be important because there are scenarios where, say, your opponent is maybe playing a burn deck where they could theoretically have a couple of lightning bolts, and you need to very carefully get your creature to, say, 7 toughness instead of 6 to be sure you can't be. Maybe you suited up your Heliod's Pilgrim. You need to make sure you've got 6 toughness instead of 5. There can be some weird outside cases where just making sure you're properly counting up what's out there and knowing the difference between what Ancestral Mask and Ethereal Armor do in terms of tracking enchantments and whatnot. Anyway, Rancor, the other power-ups we have here are Cartouche of Strength, which enchant creature gets +1/+1 and has trample, and it also fights another creature. One of the little nuances about Cartouche of Strength is that when Cartouche of Strength enters the battlefield, you may have enchanted creature fight target creature in opponent controls. So where this can matter is you throw your Cartouche of Strength down on your hexproof creature. You're going up against something like Stompy, and they Vines of Vastwood their creature in response to the Cartouche of Strength. Don't just mindlessly click yes to everything. The Cartouche of Strength will create a trigger when it comes into play for the fighting. If your opponent responds to that, making their creature a lot bigger where you would lose the fight, you can simply decline to have your creature go through with the fight. So, just think about what you're doing. If your opponent reacts, adjust accordingly. Cartouche of Strength is really good and really strong because it has the limitation of enchant creature you control. There are going to be plenty of people who are going to utilize standard bearers as a hate card to shut you down. And typically Boggles outs on that are Cartouche of Strength from the main board, along with some kind of combination of gut shots and electrickeries from the sideboard. What you need to know, and we'll be skipping ahead a little bit here to talk about the sideboard, is when you go up against decks that have white mana and you're going into game 2, you're probably going to have to proactively sideboard for standard bearer even if you haven't seen it yet. Because if you don't do that, if you're not moving in some gut shots or some electrickeries and they bring in standard bearer and all you've got is a single Cartouche of Strength, it's going to be pretty hard to hit that. And I guess the one Cartouche seems to not be some kind of weird abnormality. That seems to be a reasonable place where these deck lists are at. The deck lists are fairly tight. This creature package is pretty. They're not nothing weird, nothing cutesy going on here. This is pretty nuts and bolts, and the enchantment package is fairly tight also. But anyway, the whole point is that Cartouche of Strength is one of your main board cards that can actually deal with Standard Bearer, because Standard Bearer says if an opponent plays a spell or an ability that could target a flag bearer in play, that player chooses at least one flag bearer as a target. So if your opponent has a Standard Bearer in play, that means that you can't put ethereal armor on your creature because you have to put it on the Standard Bearer. You can't put Rancor on your creature. You can't put an ancestral mask on your creature. You can't put an armadillo cloak on your creature. The only pump spells you can play are Cartouche of Solidarity and Cartouche of Strength, because they're both templated with enchant creature you control. So they get around Standard Bearer. But Standard Bearer bricks all your pump spells for the most part. Otherwise, there's some other sideboard things you could bring in, but Cartouche of Strength is a nice, sweet out. Anyway, moving along, we've also got Abundant Growth, which helps to color fix. These lists tend to run a pretty fair bit more green mana sources than white mana sources. You can see with this list you've got 4 Blossoming Sands, a single Ash Barrens, and a single Plains. You've got 10 forests and 2 Kalani Garden. The 0/1 creature that you get off the Kalani Garden is important, because not only is it a creature that in some weird scenarios where you're just not hitting any creatures, you could suit up with a bunch of plus enchantment power and maybe have some crazy scenario where you have like a 20/20 originally 0/1 plant token. But more normally, that 0/1 plant token is something that can soak up an edict effect. And you need to be planning around this because there's a fair bit of Chainer's Edicts out there right now. So I do like Kalani Garden in the list, although because you are basically an aggro deck, being able to effectively drop your mana and play your threats in a timely fashion is important. So I think that running 2 Kalani Gardens, not having 4, this seems like a pretty reasonable take. You don't want too many comes into play tapped lands. Anyway, Abundant Growth helps to smooth out your mana without costing you any cards. It's a 1 mana enchantment that cantrips and allows the land that it's placed on to produce 1 mana of any color. This is important not just because it generates white mana, but also because these decks in their sideboard tend to occasionally have blue for Dispel. Sometimes you'll see other 1 mana counter spells in this place, but Dispel is fairly standard. You'll also see Electrickery and Gut Shot are pretty common as well. And Flaring Pain is also not unusual because if your opponent has, say you go up against an Infinite Fog deck, or maybe an opponent that has prismatic strands, Flaring Pain can be a nice way to be able to punch through. In addition, we also have the mana fixing and acceleration, a little bit of ramp from Utopia Sprawl. It can only go on a forest, which is another reason why these deck lists tend to run more forests than plains. Of course, your primary, most important one drops are also forests, so that's another reason. The Utopia Sprawl says whenever Enchanted Forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of the chosen color to his or her mana pool. So, whereas the Abundant Growth simply replaces the effect of your tapped land with add 1 mana of any color, the Utopia Sprawl basically allows you to add an additional mana of a chosen color that will not change throughout the course of the game. So if you put Utopia Sprawl in a forest, you can tap that forest now for 2 mana instead of 1. The Utopia Sprawls and the Abundant Growths also double as providing additional power for your ethereal armors by having more enchantments on the board, and same thing for Ancestral Mask. So that's mostly the key components of what we're dealing with out of the main core deck here. Heliod's Pilgrim is a tutor effect that allows you to situationally go through your deck and get the precise enchantment that you need. Against the burn matchup, it's nice to have extra ways to hit your life gain enabling enchantments such as Armadillo Cloak. And usually I think having a singleton lifelink in the sideboard is just fine as well. Just so you get to 5 of those plus the 2 Heliod's Pilgrims adds a little more consistency to your ability to actually hit on a life gain effect to hopefully have a chance to beat out burn. Also, since your creatures have hexproof, that's helpful. Although typically red burn decks are gonna have something like Electrickery, possibly not as often, but occasionally even something like Martyr of Ashes, which can kill your creatures even when they get a little bit larger. So let me just pull that up for you. And I mention this because just because you get your creature to 2 toughness, you shouldn't necessarily, I guess it would help if we could spell today. So Martyr of Ashes is a 1 mana 1/1 red creature. Pay 2 mana, reveal X cards from your hand, sacrifice Martyr of Ashes. Martyr of Ashes deals X damage to each creature without flying. So just because you get your creature to 2 toughness if you're up against a burn deck, you still want to be a little bit cautious and probably try to get your creature's toughness up a bit more as soon as possible so you don't get blown out by a Martyr of Ashes. Anyway, this Ash Barrens is interesting. I don't know if that's necessarily a standard inclusion. So here's another list that does not run any Ash Barrens. They just go with another forest because hitting your drops is important. I do like the 2 Colony Gardens. I like the 10 Forests. I like the 4 Blossoming Sands. I like the 1 Plains. I'm not sure about this 1 Ash Barrens. I think maybe, I generally do like Carve's list, but I feel like maybe the Ash Barrens should just be another forest. Maybe that, it's one of those things where these little margins make a difference. Sometimes they help you, sometimes they hurt you, but they're definitely worth thinking about. Otherwise, some other things to keep in mind is, again, in terms of not going full zombie, your Solana Ledgewalker can actually blow past a creature with reach. And most of you probably get this, but for the few of you out there that might not realize it, Solana Ledgewalker doesn't have flying. It just says can't be blocked except by creatures with flying. So this is actually even better than flying. Whenever you go up against a creature that has reach, reach says you can block a creature with flying. But Solana Ledgewalker doesn't have flying. So it's just one of those weird interactions there. Out of the sideboard, this natural state, this is okay. So here's a different setup where they've added an extra Flaring Pain, and I think that's probably the main thing. Let's see here with the young, yeah, that's kind of the main thing. I think this natural state's one of the more flexible slots in your sideboard. I think having a couple of Dispels is probably a pretty good call. Going 1 Electrickery is a little small, but we do have 3 Gut Shots, so you can see over here the other way around, 3 Electrickery, 1 Gut Shot. I don't have a strong opinion on what combination, but having some combination of 3 or 4 Electrickeries and Gut Shots seems pretty good. Having a singleton lifelink I think is also a good idea. Having 2 or 3 young wolves in your sideboard is important. Depending on how many edict effects you're running into, should probably dictate whether you're going to have access to 2, 3, or 4 young wolves. And this natural state I think is a flexible option. It's good in the mirror match. It's good against uh, affinity, and it'll have some other applications against various artifacts and enchantments out there. Crimson Acolyte is interesting because uh, it if you can get this in play early, then it also gives you some extra game against things like Electrickery and against Swirling Sandstorm, against Martyr of Ashes. Swirling Sandstorm is a 4 mana 1 red 3 colorless sorcery that does 5 damage to all creatures if you have 7 cards in your graveyard. So there's Izzet Delver usually has, okay, most of those lists have had 1 or 2 copies of Swirling Sandstorm in their sideboard. Another reason to monitor your hexproof creature's toughness and try to get to 6 instead of 5. And Flaring Pain, having 2 copies here is probably nice just so you can hit it with a little more consistency, although having one's fine. I mean, there's not a whole lot of Infinite Fog out there. The decks that run Prismatic Strands usually just have a few copies. They usually don't have a full playset. So being able to jam through some kind of a damage prevention it's not it's not completely necessary, but it is good. It's in some situations it can be the difference between winning and losing. Having your own copies of Standard Bearer is also okay. This gives you a little bit of game in the mirror match, depending on how many Boggles decks are running around out there, and that can be good. It's also good, in other various situations. I've talked about this before in other videos, where this can be good against all kinds of random stuff. It shuts down a lot of the powerful activated abilities from in the Elves deck. It's good in the mirror match. It's also good against the Tireless Tribe combo because they can't cast Inside Out on their tribe as long as Standard Bearer is in play. So there's all kinds of random fringe applications where Standard Bearer can be good. Standard Bearer is just one of those cards that the more you play it, the more you begin to see that there's just all kinds of value that might not be apparent at first. So that's basically the deck. I'm going to take a minute to talk about some of the obvious interactions. So some of you might some of you that haven't played a lot of Boggles or played against a lot of Boggles with these Delver decks might intuitively think that that the Boggles deck has a really sweet matchup against Delver because of all their hexproof creatures. That is not always the case. It's not as good as you would think because you're leaning a lot on 1 and 2 mana creatures, which means you're a prime candidate to get blown up by Spell Stutter sprites, with the ninjas going in and returning the Spell Stutter sprites, and then having them replay Spell Stutter sprites to just keep you shut down, along with the fact that Counterspell can also keep you off balance. And then post sideboard, Electrickeries and Swirling Sandstorm can just really be brutal, and sometimes we also have a null in the sideboard, which is also rough. You're going to have a better game against the mono blue Delver list than you will against Izzet Delver, because Izzet Delver does have access to Electrickery and Swirling Sandstorm, and that does make a reasonable difference in the matchup for sure. But just know that you have to really choose wisely and sometimes get lucky as far as what your opponent not being able to continuously shut you down with Spell Stutter sprites. Against Kuldotha Boros, it's a similar situation where they usually this list has a Coalition Honor Guard. There's a lot of these lists that'll have Standard Bearers in the sideboard. They usually have some core Sanctifiers which blow up enchantments, and usually there's some Prismatic Strands. There's also enough aggression coming out of this deck that if it can keep you off of life gain, sometimes it can outrace you. Another thing is that if you happen to suit up, if you get in a jam where you can't draw a hexproof creature and you suit up one of your other creatures, Alchemist Vial can also shut you down. So this is there's all kinds of drawbacks to having to power up a non-hexproof creature when that occurs. And Journey to Nowhere can also, again, eat your powered up non-hexproof creatures. So it is important. You might think, well, it doesn't matter if I can get to 10 toughness on my 0/1 plant token, I'll be out of the range of burn. But it's just kind of worth knowing that may not get you out of the woods. So it's a winnable matchup. if I'm playing boggles, I'd probably rather face Kuldotha than Izzet Delver just because of how annoying the spell stutter sprites can be. Against Tron, you're going to have a pretty. Normally, you can just plow through your opponent before they can start to shut you down. These lists that run Stonehorn Dignitary are very tricky because they keep you from having a combat phase. And what this means is that Flaring Pain's not going to help. So this is different from a fog effect that prevents the damage. You don't even get to attack, so there's no damage to be prevented, which means boarding in the Flaring Pain's not going to do anything for you if you go up against a Tron matchup where they are leaning on the Dignitary. So this is purely a racing situation, generally speaking, when you're going up against the Stonehorn Dignitary. Now, if you're going up against the decks that include Moment's Peace, then the Flaring Pain can matter, because if they are leaning on a bunch of fog effects, being able to bang through that damage and get past that damage prevention is going to be quite handy. Another thing you have to watch out for is these Tron lists will occasionally have protection from green, and the way that circles of protection are worded, most of you probably already know this, but they say the next time a source, which means it's not a targeting effect, which means circles of protection are not stopped by hexproof. So you can also just get completely shut down. Now, the way I'm talking about this, you might feel like, wow, these Tron matchups must be really, really, impossible to win. But they're really not, because a lot of times they're going to stumble to get online enough that you can bang through and win while they're trying to get their whole Tron package together. Sometimes they'll beat you, sometimes they'll assemble it. But if I have to choose between being on the Tron side or the Boggle side in the matchup, I want to be on the Boggle side. With Kuldotha and Boggles, I marginally want to be on the Boggles side. Izzet Delver and Boggles, I kind of want to be on Izzet Delver. Mono Blue Delver and Boggles, I want to be on the Boggles side. So it's kind of how I break it down. I'm not saying that's completely, absolutely how it is, but it's my general take. Elves, it's kind of weird because this is one of those just bizarre, crazy matchup things where it depends on how it plays out. Either one of these decks can just blow out the other side before they get going. Elves is usually going to have access to Gleeful Sabotage, at least 3 or 4 copies, generally speaking. Sometimes they have fog effects. So you've got all that nonsense going on where they can blow up your enchantments in fog. They also have Timberwatch Elf. Sometimes they can just straight up outrace you. But what really gets weird are the Well-Wishers. Sometimes the Elf deck can get 20 Elves on board with 2 Well-Wishers and gain 40 life a turn, and actually forestall the inevitable long enough. And you can get to these like bizarro weird games where they're gaining a bajillion life every turn, but you've got a life link, 30, 30, 40, 40 creatures, so you're banging in for all this damage every turn and gaining an absurd amount of life. But in the long run, if the elves can sustain and keep building their elf army and gain enough life to outrun you, eventually they can get this massive situation where their Timberwatch elves can start pumping elves for 60, 70, 80, 100 damage. So it can be weird. The Boggles has the better early race. The elves has the better long game. And I don't know what side of this matchup I really want to be on. I feel like it's kind of 50-50. I probably want to be on the elf side, unless you're packing, 2 or 3 electrickeries, then I like the Boggles. So a lot of it probably has to do with the sideboard stuff and how that plays out. Against Burn, Boggle's pretty good. A lot of times, depending on how your sideboard and your main deck are put together, you're going to be able to have the consistency to get access to enough life gain to make it work. And then as far as Stompy goes, Boggles is just going to be better, although Stompy does have access to Gleeful Sabotage and that kind of stuff usually. So sometimes Stompy can get it done. Blue-black control, we run into edict effects. This has a lot to do with how many edict effects they're running. And the other thing is, depends on how much the player is paying attention. They really need to use their disfigures and their targeted removal on your non-hexproof creatures and really focus on saving their edict effects for your hexproof creatures. If they work that all out correctly, then it can be a really miserable matchup. Inside Out combo can kind of sort of race with you and counterspell enough of your stuff to keep you off balance. So they also typically have standard bearers in the sideboard, so that can be kind of annoying as well. And it can be kind of a tricky matchup. Affinity is weird because they're probably going to have some enchantment hate, and they can race you, but it depends on how much enchantment hate they're packing and how quickly they hit the board. Because of your life gain and just how huge your creatures can get, I probably want to be on boggles, but the sideboards matter. I already talked about Mono Blue Delver. The mirror is just who hits their sideboard stuff and how it plays out. Mono Black control can have a lot of edict effects, so that can be kind of miserable. And yeah, against Izzet Blitz, it's pretty much a race, and yeah, that pretty much covers it. That's basically Boggles. It's a fun deck. If you are familiar with playing Boggles in Modern, then Boggles can be a fantastic entry point in Pauper, because while there are definitely differences in how the decks play out, it's similar enough that it's going to feel really comfortable. It's also a deck that if there's definitely lines of play and a lot of thinking and calculation that you need to do. So I think a lot of times there can be this narrative that Boggles is, oh, any idiot can play Boggles. This is not true. But if you do want to play a more linear style of deck that has less decision trees in a lot of circumstances, you just want to, you want to have fun, chill, kind of chat with your friends, not have to kill yourself with, 7, 8, 9 different lines of play to calculate through. Boggles can just be a nice, fun, deck to go take to your local LGS if your LGS has Pauper events to play. As far as online, I think right now this is a fair representation of where it is in the metagame for Magic Online, somewhere around 10th, 11th, 12th best deck in the format, probably about right. So I don't hugely recommend it if you're just pure spike value grinding, want to be playing your the best EV deck. I can't recommend Boggles, but it's a fun deck, and you can probably net positive with it. So yeah, if you want to try it out. You're going to have a lot of ups and downs though. So if you run it out there, you could go 2 or 3 leagues where everything just feels terrible, nothing's working, you're losing tickets, and then you could have 2 or 3 leagues in a row where you go 4-1, 5-0, 4-1, and you think it's the best deck ever. But you just got to moderate your expectations. You can't get sucked into thinking it really is the best deck ever. And when you go through those down swings with people, there's a lot of sideboard hate for Boggles, so you can go through some real droughts when you play this deck as well. So keep all that in mind. Whatever deck you're playing, hope you're able to have great success and stack up a lot of tickets. Till our next video, peace!